Chapter 7 of Richard the First. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ernst Patinama. Richard the First by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 7. The Embarkation. The plan which Richard had formed for conveying his expedition to the Holy Land was to embark it on board a fleet of ships which he was sending round to Marseille for this purpose, with orders to await him there. Marseille is in the south of France, not far from the Mediterranean Sea. Richard might have embarked his troops in the English Channel, but that, as the reader will see from looking on the map of Europe, would require them to take a long sea voyage around the coasts of France and Spain, and through the Straits of Gibraltar. Richard thought it best to avoid this long circuit for his troops, and so he sent the ships round, with no more men on board than necessary to manoeuvre them, while he marched his army across France by land. As for Philip, he had no ships of his own. England was a maritime country, and had long possessed a fleet. This fleet had been very much increased by the exertions of Henry II, Richard's father, who had built several new ships, some of them of very large size, expressly for the purpose of transporting troops to Palestine. Henry himself did not live to execute his plans, and so he left his ships for Richard. France, on the other hand, was not then a maritime country. Most of the harbours on the northern coast belonged to Normandy, and even in the south the ports did not belong to the King of France. Philip, therefore, had no fleet of his own, but he had made arrangements with the Republic of Genoa to furnish him with ships, and so his plan was to march over the mountains to that city and embark there, while Richard should go south to Marseille. Richard drew up a curious set of rules and regulations for the government of this fleet while it was making the passage. Some of the rules were the following. 1. That if any man killed another, the murderer was to be lashed to the dead body and buried alive with it, if the murder was committed in port or on the land. If the crime was committed at sea, then the two bodies, bound together as before, were to be launched overboard. 2. If any man, with a knife or with any other weapon, struck another so as to draw blood, then he was to be punished by being ducked 3 times over head and ears, by being let down from the yard arm of the ship into the sea. 3. For all sorts of profane and abusive language, the punishment was a fine of an ounce of silver for each offence. 4. Any man convicted of theft, or pickery as it was called, was to have his head shaved and hot pitch poured over it, and upon that the feathers of some pillow or cushion were to be shaken. The offender was then to be turned ashore on the first land that the ship might reach, and there be abandoned to his fate. The penalty named in this last article is the first instance in which any account of the punishment of tarring and feathering is mentioned, and this is supposed to be the origin of that extraordinary and very cruel mode of punishment. The king put a fleet under the command of 3 grand officers of his court, and he commanded all his seamen and marines to obey them strictly in all things, as they would obey the king himself if he had been on board. The fleet met with a great variety of adventures on its way to Marseille. It had not proceeded far before a great tempest arose and scattered the ships in every direction. At last a considerable number of them succeeded in making their way, in a disabled condition, into the Tagus, in order to seek succor in Lisbon. The King of Portugal was at this time at war with the Moors, who had come over from Africa and invaded his dominions. he proposed to the Crusaders on board the ships to wait a little while and assist him in fighting the Moors. "They are as great infidels," said he, "as any that you will find in the Holy Land." The commanders of the fleet acceded to this proposal, but the crews, when they were landed, soon made so many raids in Lisbon, and involved themselves in such frequent and bloody affrays with the people of the city, that the King of Portugal was soon eager to send them away. So in due time they embarked again in order to continue the voyage. In the meantime, while the fleet was thus going round by sea, Richard and Philip were engaged in assembling the forces and making preparation to march by land. The two armies, when finally organized, came together at a place of rendezvous called Vézelay, where there were great plains suitable for the camping ground of a great military force. Vézelay was on the road to Lyons, and the armies, after they had met, marched in company to the latter city. The number of troops assembled was very great. The united army amounted, it is said, to 100,000 men. This was a very large force for those days. The great difficulty was to find provision for them from day to day during the march. Supplies of provisions for such a host cannot be carried far, so that armies are obliged to live on the produce of the country that they march through, which is collected for this purpose by foragers from day to day. The allied armies, as they moved slowly on, impoverished and distressed the whole country through which they passed, by devouring everything that the people had in store. At length, after marching together for some time, they came to the place where the roads separated, and King Philip turned off to the left in order to proceed through the passes of the Alps toward Genoa, while Richard and his hosts proceeded southward toward Marseille. When he reached Marseille, Richard found that his fleet had not arrived. The delay was occasioned by the storm and the subsequent detention of the crews at Lisbon. And yet it was very long after the time originally appointed for the sailing of the expedition. The time first appointed was the last of March, but Philip could not go at that time on account of the death of his queen, which took place just before the appointed period. Nor was Richard himself ready. It was not until the 30th of August that the fleet arrived at Marseille. When Richard found that the fleet had not come, he was greatly disappointed. He had no means of knowing when to expect it, for there were no postal or other communications across the country in those days, as now, by which tidings could be conveyed to him. He waited 8 days very impatiently, and then concluded to go on himself toward the east, and leave orders for the fleet to follow him. So he hired 10 large vessels and 20 galleys of the merchants of Marseille, and in these he embarked a portion of his forces, leaving the rest to come in the great fleet when it should arrive. They were to proceed to Messina in Sicily, where Richard was to join them. With the vessels that he had hired, he proceeded along the coast to Genoa, where he found Philip, the French king, who had arrived there safely before him by land. From Marseille to Genoa, the course lies toward the northeast along the coast of France. Thence, in going toward Messina, it turns toward the southeast and follows the coast of Italy. The route may be traced very easily on any map of modern Europe. The reason why Messina had been appointed as the great intermediate rendezvous of the fleet was twofold. In the first place, it was a convenient port for this purpose, being a good harbor and being favorably situated about midway of the voyage. Then, besides, Richard had a sister residing there. Her name was Joanna. She had married the king of the country. Her husband had died, it is true, and she was, at that time, in some sense retired from public life. She was indeed in some distress, for the throne had been seized by a certain Tancred, who was her